All right, whoever you are, the time has come. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown, and if this is a regular thing for you, what's up? How's everybody doing? Did your week go okay? If that's not you, welcome. Come on in. Make yourself comfortable. I have an important talk to share with you today with Luvena Rangel. I'm going to tell you about that some in just a bit. But first, let me thank everyone who reached out to me. I want to let everyone know that I'm feeling much better. If you were listening last week, I was talking about some pain issues that reemerged for me. Well, I took a few days off and I was able to turn it around pretty darn quick. I'm feeling pretty much back up to my usual self again. And if you've been around long enough, years ago when this show first started is when I first started admitting to those pain patterns. I was doing these intros in tears, and really at that time, I felt lost. I felt like I didn't have any tools to address it. I didn't know what to do about the pain I was in, and I was feeling debilitated by it. The good news is that I clearly do have some tools now that I didn't have a few years ago when I started this, because it was months and months of a process of like 6 months to 8 months it took me to turn it around at the beginning. And this time it took me 3 days. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty big improvement. The important thing is that I feel like I have a pattern to address it. You see, I've stopped thinking of my pain as like areas of my body that are injured almost. Because I didn't do anything with my body. I didn't push it too hard or do something that was inappropriate, and then that's why I was in pain. It was a gradual thing that ultimately kind of climaxed in me having to stay in bed for a few days. And I think of a friend of mine, Leslie Kaminoff. I remember him saying, first your body whispers to you, and then it tries to speak rationally to you, and then it starts screaming at you. And that, I think, is sort of what happens with me, is I'll kind of override certain signals, or I'll misconstrue the messages conveniently for myself. But it really is a pattern. It's a pattern of behavior and thought. And now I think I have other patterns of behavior and thought that mean I'm not having pain. So, in any case, I really do appreciate all of the supportive sentiments, and it means a lot to me that you would reach out. So, thanks, y'all. Feeling better. Unfortunately, the news on the household pet front is not as good. The cats are doing just fine. They're ruling the household, and we're getting used to them and they're getting used to us. But Goldie the goldfish, she has gotten the stink end of the stick. Last week, I mentioned that the cats had been tormenting Goldie the goldfish, just prowling around and hanging out around the tank. Well, now Goldie's just hiding behind her plant all the time. She didn't even come out when I went to feed her the other day. She did eat it. I saw that she ate it, but she used to be all over the tank. She had this like personality, Goldie, and like now she's just hiding behind the plant. Clearly the cats have traumatized her. We've started keeping the cats out of that room, closing the door, but still, she's still doing it. I think maybe it's going to take a little time. Maybe she'll start to come back to her usual self. So, for whatever that's worth, for those of you who've been following along, I finally got Goldie back up to health, and then we got the cats, and now she's been traumatized. What are you going to do? Does anybody know how to help address goldfish trauma? Oh, what's that nonsense? We've got important stuff to do here today, don't we? As I was saying, Luvena Rangel is here, and I did not know Luvena before this conversation. someone, a listener of this show, whose name I cannot recall and was unable to track down. Whoever you are, you know who you are. I'm very sorry, but this listener sent me an email pointing me to a particular blog post. And, I have not named the author of that blog post. I didn't name that person while I was talking to Luvena, and I'm not going to name her right now because I don't want it to be about a person or a personality. I want it to be about ideas. I will mention the person on the other side just because I think you should be able to go read the blog post and find it. So I'll tell you on the other side of the conversation, but there was good reason and purpose why I didn't name the person outright. In any case, after going and reading this blog post, there was then a response to that blog post by Luvena. And I found her response to be impactful on me. It touched on all these different threads that I've been discussing on this show around cultural appropriation. Maybe you remember me talking about doing chanting in the past, or I've had several other guests on talking about yoga and social justice, and I just thought that Luvena's perspective was insightful and informative, and I learned a lot, and I think that you will too. I'm very glad for you to hear it today. Before we do, let me just mention some upcoming travel gigs I've got going. I've got a few more gigs happening in 2019, just a few. I'm going to be in Harrisonburg, Virginia, November 2nd, and Essex, Connecticut, November 15th and 16th. You can find about those gigs on the website. Go to the calendar page for those. And those are going to be my last travel gigs for 2019. But I also want to mention that the Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain Tour 2020 is a go. In fact, the first half of the year has already been settled upon. The dates have been posted. There's registration open. I'm super excited about this, you guys. Maybe you remember I mentioned this some weeks back that I was going to plan this tour for myself and try something different. Well, it wasn't exactly what I initially planned, but it's turned into an equally great, if not better situation. I'm going to go into it more in the future, but I just wanted to drop these dates and let everybody know if you're in these towns, I'm coming to you. So here you go. I'm just going to drop them. London, England, January 11th and 12th. Vienna, Austria, January 15th and 16th. Berlin, Germany, January 17th and 18th. Then I'm coming back to the States. I'll be in Las Cruces, New Mexico, February 8th and 9th. Austin, Texas, April 11th and 12th. Madison, Wisconsin, May 30th, 31st. And Canada, Gulf, Ontario, June 13th and 14th. Boom! There's also going to be some dates in Australia in there, and I believe a gig in Florida as well, but that will make up the first leg, the first half of the tour. What do you think? Are you in those towns? If you want to hang out, this is going to be a really cool opportunity. These are not going to be big groups, y'all. The space is limited, so early registration is strongly advised. You can find out about it and register for any of those dates at jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. Go check that out. All right. So with that, I am going to touch base with you on the other side. I'll let you know who's coming on next week and make a few other comments. But for now, I think it's time for us to get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Luvena Rangel. Hello?
Hello.
Oh, you're here.
I am. I just got in here.
Excellent. Would you do me a favor and pronounce your name for me? Because I have a feeling I'm about to mangle it.
It's Luvena. Luvena Rangel.
Luvena. Hello, Luvena.
Hello. Now you need to tell me how exactly I'm going to call you because I've never spoken to anyone with just one initial as the first name.
Well, you can call me Jay.
Okay.
And that is short
Right.
for Jason. And my friends have always called me Jay. There's always been another Jason Brown wherever I've lived. And I decided to use J period years ago because I thought it was writerly.
Funnily enough, I've known many Jasons, and at least one of them who was extremely close to me also ended up just being called Jay. So when I saw Jay Brown, I said, could this be another Jason? So and there you are. Yes.
There
Okay.
you are indeed. Well, thank you so much for giving me some of your time. I put a lot of value on people's time, and so thank you for sharing some of yours with me today.
Thank you for having me over. Thank you for the invitation, Jay.
Well, I think I mentioned to you in my email why this came about. A listener of this show, whose name is eluding me in this moment, I'm very sorry, but this listener sent me an email with a link to a blog post that you wrote. Mm-hmm. And I have a feeling that this listener has listened for a very long time to this show because there was good reason why she sent me that link. And why, after reading your blog post, I almost immediately reached out to you.
Okay.
Which is because there was a number of sort of threads that I've been picking on in terms of the conversations I'm having on this show that were woven together in what you were writing.
Okay.
And just by way of sort of setting a little frame for us today, I've boiled them down to what I think of as kind of three things, and you'll correct me if you think there's something else there. But what I saw from your post was a conversation I've been having a lot, especially in my teacher's class, about what is the difference between like movement or fitness science and yoga? Like, where do those two things, there's certainly intersection, but what are there distinctions between those two things, and what are those distinctions? Mm-hmm. And then it seemed to me that you were responding, someone else had written a blog post about that, and you were responding to what they had said, and it really raised a whole question about appropriation, which is another conversation I've been having on the show. And so those are some of the things that I think were motivating me to reach out to you, and I was curious to hear your perspective on.
Right.
And I guess before we jump into those questions, I am curious to learn a little bit about you and set a little bit of context for where your perspective comes from.
Right. So I am currently in India. I am an Indian national, an Indian citizen. I was born and raised in the Middle East, and I was the third generation there, so my children end up being the fourth. But I moved to India 5.5 years ago for personal reasons, and here I am. My yoga journey began, I think, when I was a child, but not the way most yoga teachers or Indian yoga teachers say that, it was in our family and we did this as part of our family culture or anything. Nothing. It had nothing to do with my family. No one in my family practices yoga. And I don't think any of my grandparents practice yoga either. I'm the only one in the family, let alone being a yoga teacher. And but yoga found me rather when I was absolutely exploring what the bits of life looked like. So I did approach it from a very external view because I didn't know any better. But being very philosophical right from a very young age, I think I don't do anything very topically, and I wanted to understand better, deeper. So it was purely to satisfy my curiosity initially. And then as the practice went on, I realized that I was identifying less with the outside and more with the philosophy and what's happening on the inside. I come from a background in medicine and holistic health, so along with a corporate career. So I had two sides of me which were constantly working with each other, and then there was a very spiritual side of things. So when I moved to India, I just chose to use all three of them, initially very clumsily. I didn't even know what that integration looked like, but I did see a stark difference with how teachers in the West taught and practiced yoga, as opposed to how practitioners, by and large, in India approached it. And I saw that there were things that we could do in India that were different, without actually completely destroying the essence. Because one of the biggest observations was that although yoga originated in India and we have a very strong philosophical base, and so many of us really resonate with the culture and the history of yoga, what most studios and most teachers are doing now is that they are repurposing it by buying into the rebranded Western edition of yoga, and that was painful. That was hurtful, because it was just a revisiting of what happened during colonization. We are so one of that's basically one of where I come from and why my work is informed on those lines. I speak purely from, not only from an academic point of view, I speak from a lived experience point of view. I'm here right now. We're not speaking about just any Indian yoga teacher who might be, just an image. I am that person. And I'm mindful about not being representative of the entire country, but I think it's very important that people outside of India, and especially in the West, see this side of or these different perspectives. And I think that's where I come from.
Wow. Well, it's something that's been talked about with a number of people on this show, about how folks in like the 70s and 80s went to India and met the teachers there, and then brought it back here to the West and to New York and ultimately branded and there was a talk, everybody was talking about mainstreaming. We need to mainstream yoga. Mm-hmm. And they succeeded in that. And in that process, there seemed to me to be things that got sacrificed, important, as you said, essence of things. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then I've had other people, I've spoke to another Indian woman who talked about her first yoga in India being these power yoga classes, which is sort of what you're describing, where like what happened to yoga in the West got brought back to India in a way.
Yes.
And it's interesting because it does seem to me there's almost generational differences sometimes, like younger generations speak about it different than older generations. And when I hear you speaking about colonization and it having a feeling of that to it, that's a different perspective.
But it isn't. It's very, very simple. It's so in your face that the moment you see the analogy, and it's so stark, it's in your face, and you'd wonder why you didn't see it before, why you didn't see it that way before. So I'm really looking forward to place that out in our conversation, because it's so obvious that it's crazy sometimes that you miss it and you try to question why people are talking about colonization, and no, that's not what we're doing. But the moment you spell it out, and it's a very easy small spelling, then there's no undoing it. Then there's no unknowing. You can't fake ignorance anymore. So it's there. And it's not just for the non-Indians. It's not just for the West. It is as much for the Indians to recognize what they're doing. Because in a way, with that ignorance, or we are also being part of the circle. We are also being part of that loop of continuing it if we don't stop, pause, and realize, because there's so many isms involved in all of this. There's so many perspectives. But the thing is, most of the times, that logical approach of looking at a very capitalistic view of things tends to overshadow and cloud nuance, tends to overshadow and cloud history, or where is this coming from? And the very essence of it is that for most of us, history, in a way, the generational trauma that's there, that we carry, kind of magnetizes itself on us. It becomes a part of our genetic baggage. It becomes a part of our DNA, and we tend to operate that way without knowing that we're just perpetuating a stereotype because of a history. And there are so many angles to it. You can look at it in so many different ways. But bottom line is, even if you use just one aspect of history on colonization and the economical effects of colonization, it answers the whole thing. It makes you see what is considered what is considered as harmless today, or it's the way of life, will be looked upon 20 or 30 years or 100 years later and saying, you know what, this is what they did. They did this all over again, and they didn't even realize they were being had.
Okay, so let's pick that apart a little bit, or unpack that some. And maybe we'll use the example of your post, which was called Too Much Ado Around Isms. As you said, there's lots of isms, right? Or is it? Mm-hmm. And it was a response to a blog post that you read, or was it like an Instagram post or something? I'm not sure. But it seemed to me, again, this person, this teacher, someone who is really interested in movement science, as far as I can tell. And that's a big thread. I know there was a lot of conversations going on around, is what this person doing yoga, or is it movement? And a lot of teachers I know actually decided that they stopped calling what they were teaching yoga because they felt like it was more movement than yoga, and which I sort of appreciated. But some people are sort of saying you can't make those distinctions, and it seemed to me that's what was being said in this blog post. What was it about that blog post to you that you responded to initially?
So, yes, it was a blog post. It was a blog post that spoke about movement science. If we stopped at movement science, if we stopped at just anatomy and the kinesiology of it, and how the mechanism of movement explains or informs yoga asana, I wouldn't have a problem. I teach anatomy as well. I wouldn't really have a problem. But dipping into and then conflating that, or bringing in the argument with the attempt to justify it in terms of philosophy, in terms of making a claim, sometimes those claims are made very flippantly. They're made with with an implicit bias, and then justified with, that's not what I said. And but unfortunately, when things like that are done, so what was done in that blog was there was the reference made to Krishnamacharya, and there was a reference very, very cleverly put in, which said that should Krishnamacharya be alive today, or had he been alive today, then because he was already, or history shows that he was influenced by the Swedish gymnasts and all of that, that he most likely would have borrowed from Pilates today, and then there were some other things which don't come to mind immediately, but there were a series of casually thrown about references and points, and the tone, the very condescending tone, was not lost on many of us. So it wasn't just one person reading, many of us reading, and it was in English. It was not in some Sanskrit or something that we had to decipher or decode and figure out, is that what she means? So it was in English, and the pain that came from all of that was an erasure and a misinterpretation of what a yoga teacher brought, and an assumption made that if he would have been alive today, that he himself would have, broken down or borrowed it or whatever. Now, there are a number of ways you look at it. One is, if we pause to think of what is causing me harm, sometimes you can't really explain what is painful in a given scenario, and I give that a lot to what I refer to as generational trauma. Now, and it really falls back on dominance. It falls back on what people think of in terms of the weightage of what the Indian individual has offered the practice today, or what history has provided. So the pain initially was something that we couldn't quite put a finger on, at least for me. So let me speak about myself. I couldn't quite put a finger on about what in that post made me uncomfortable. So I sat with it. And I thought that maybe it's just a reaction, it's a knee-jerk reaction. Maybe I'm just being too sensitive about it. And I waited. And, a little while later, I realized that this wasn't shifting. And I questioned it. I looked at the blog again. I read it again. And that's when certain references, because I had to use a little bit of logic. I had to use a little bit of my intellect to make sure that I was not being purely reactive about it. And that's when all of these signs or these words and points of absolute deflection, condescension, erasure, or just ignoring, just not paying attention or refusing to even acknowledge that someone is opening out to say that she has been harmed by your words and your actions. It's words that she has acted out by putting down on a blog. So it is an action. Mm-hmm. When she responded, the response kind of underscored the pain and underscored an unspoken intention of sorts. Because, again, we don't know if this was implicit or explicit, but in the response, we could see further or a furthering of all of these the signs of dominance, the signs of I don't care if you've been hurt. That's not what I intended. I'm not apologizing because you're being too sensitive. And that's why my too much of it came. Because people now who are educated enough in knowing what these different terms are, so there is a term. There is a term for the pain that people are experiencing. There is a post-colonial term that people know to use when they're doing decolonizing work. So when these words were being used in comments and responses from people of color, from people of Indian origin, people of South Asian origin, as well as white allies or non-colored allies, there was the pushback of we're being too much about it. There's too much of an explanation or explaining it with racism. This isn't about racism. This isn't about cultural appropriation. You are being too sensitive. And this is very, very typical of how trauma or how resistance is offered when people speak up against pain. The first thing that comes up is this is too much. You can tone it down a little bit. You can be a little kinder. You can be a little nicer. It's the same thing with feminism. It's the same thing with any of the isms, the too much concept. And so after the working title to my blog, while I realized what I was sitting with at the end, I chose that title because the entire response to that very intense and very deep reflection was that I'm not going to apologize because you're just having a tantrum right now. You're just pushing things that this is too much of everything. And it isn't. So that was that initial and a very, very painful. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I've received an email till now from her. I haven't. Mm-hmm. And again, there was, go ahead, Jay.
No, I'm listening, and I hear you. I think what my impression is one, I don't think she heard what you were saying, and I think that there's reasons why she didn't hear you. And what I imagine happening, and just to maybe fill people who are listening to this about what I heard in the blog post, was almost like it's something that happens a lot now. Like on Instagram, someone will post a picture of them doing something, whether it's like a pose or even now it's like a movement because we got the video things or whatever, right? The video posts. Yes. And then they post that and then someone will comment, that's not yoga. Mm-hmm. And then this person was responding to that by saying, you can't say that. You can't say what yoga is and what it isn't. And then one of the sort of justifications for that assertion was a very common trope, one that we have talked about on the show, about this idea that Krishnamacharya made stuff up and borrowed from Swedish gymnastics. And so, all's fair game because he was just borrowing from everything anyways, too.
Yeah.
And
yes.
That I've had conversations with plenty of people who have spoken to that and said that is not accurate. Even the author of that book, Yoga Body, wasn't saying that. But it seems like that's where the miss point is, where the hurt comes in and and then the defensive come up right there is that sort of flippant assertion of that. Which is lacking in the nuance, as you were saying before. It lacks the nuance that it requires to be accurate.
Right. No, I agree with what you're saying. In fact, like I began, there were a couple of points. The main point of her, or the premise of her initial blog was exactly as you said, that just because you see something on Instagram, don't just come in and say that is not yoga. And I do know there are loads of people, and people who don't even know the depth of what they're speaking about, who go and say this is not yoga. It's just a waste of time if you have to just go and keep doing that, if you don't have anything constructive to add or no education to give on why you're saying this is not yoga. So I fully agree with what you are saying. I do. That if you don't know the depth of it, and no, maybe it isn't, it's just an asana practice. I personally do often, I wonder why every graduate of a YTT graduates with a certificate, and then the next thing you know is they have an Instagram account with 45 images of different asanas. So I don't. So that is also perpetuating the idea that yoga is all about asana. And it's not just in the West. We have most of our Indian yoga teachers also who are following suit. They graduate, and the next thing you know, they have an Instagram account, and the only thing they post are asanas or videos of them doing their practice. It may be amplified with maybe a yoga quote or something like that to make it look very yogic, but it ends up being asana. That much would have been fine. It would have been okay, and it's perfectly acceptable for that argument to say, listen, this is what I want to do, and that is fine. But the thing is that if you went through the blog, she started off with that. But instead of remaining there, she did make she did have points put in, and she did make references to things that were beyond that argument or beyond that request of people, to just stay away from it. And that's where it was. She did know that she brought in those points. And it was those points that got the reaction from people. It wasn't the question about what is yoga and what isn't yoga, and if asana is, or the social media critics, I think is what she had called them. So it wasn't so much about that, at least not my post. And I really can't take a lot of responsibility for what other people have been saying. But my post had very little to do with that, but it picked on all those undercurrents and those little barbs and arrows thrown at the nuance of what people feel. Okay, even if all of us picked up the wrong thing, okay, which is usually not the way it is done, but let's assume that all of us overreacted, okay, and all of us said that, we have taken offense, and this is what it is. The point is that it's common sense for yoga teachers, at least, and contemporary yoga teachers who are well versed with the conversations. If you're going to draw in the word of cultural appropriation, if you're going to pull in the word trauma into your blog or into your podcast or interview, then you have an obligation and a responsibility to know what the terms around those conversations are. So when you have all of a sudden 20, 30 teachers of Indian origin, South Asian teachers, people of color saying that your post has caused harm, you don't go and say, sorry, your perspective of that is incorrect. You look back at what you've said. You don't go defending it. And if you're defending it without an apology for that unintended harm, then that's just pouring more salt into the wounds. And that's exactly what she did. So without more finger pointing over there, it's this entire idea of when someone says that I'm hurt, if you do not know how to apologize, at least listen. And that's exactly where you said, I don't think she heard. I don't think she was listening. She was just on a very reactive mode. And there is no amount of conversation that you can have if people are constantly going to react. And the amount of the intense emotional labor that so many teachers put out there, so many practitioners put out there in an effort to educate someone to say, this is how you caused us harm. It was just so unfair and furthering that harm. It was humiliating. It was really humiliating that we had to go and explain to someone and try to make it so, simplify the harm to say that this is what you did to us in this post. And then when you simplify it so much, it looks so simple that it looks like we're overreacting when it isn't.
No, I don't think it is. And what's interesting to me is that in the defensiveness or the reactiveness, as you're describing, there's a tone to that. You used that word earlier, and that tone of reactiveness, it sort of has like an underlying sentiment that I think you're pointing to, that sort of says like, I can do whatever I want. Don't tell me what to do. And that is where the appropriative comes creeping in, it seems to me. And what I would say is where the appropriation conversation has come up for me is, I like to chant mantra. And I remember some while back at a workshop that I did, I chanted mantra, and a woman of East Asian descent got upset and left because of it. She was like offended by me doing that. And I had never had that happen before. And I certainly was open to having conversation about that. And then with a few days later, I was back at my home studio and someone was visiting from India, a mother and daughter. And I chanted again and they were so happy about it, So I was getting sort of conflicting things. And even just like last night, just yesterday, I taught one class and it was a woman from India, but she's been here in Pennsylvania for 25 years. And I chanted Gayatri mantra at the end and she chanted with me and it was very beautiful. And afterwards I had a conversation and I asked her, I said, is it okay with you that I chant Gayatri? And she couldn't have been happier about it. So I think there's a way to honor where these things come from, I think, but it's when we're sort of claiming it or something, or I don't know, I guess that's where the line is. I'm sort of like Desikachar said to the students that I studied with, he said, take this and make it your own, make it for your culture. He asked his students to do that, but there was certainly a way of doing that is of respect and of clearly citing where these things come from, Yes. So I guess there's the nuance of it for me is how do we honor these things and when is it becoming this other thing that you're describing?
So, this is a very, very complicated question for any one individual to respond to. But before that, I just want to add that India is, or the identity is South Asian. So it's not. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for correcting me.
So that is something that if it went unchecked, then I know that you would have listeners.
See, I would have got an email for sure. I would have definitely got an email. Thank you for correcting me.
So that's one thing. Now, it's very important for people to very, very simply go and do a Google search. Just type in India and just put in map of India. Okay. And then you look at the images that pop up, and India is a huge subcontinent. Okay. So in India, and we're not just talking about contemporary India, we're talking about historical India as well. India is a land of many, many, many different people. Okay. And we're not talking about people in terms of population. We're talking about people in terms of communities. We're talking about people in terms of different social outlook in the hierarchy of caste, in the hierarchy of economic access, all of that. And when we speak today in terms of different religions as well as faith. And so it's a huge It's a vibrant culture in itself, and it's living. There are loads of different traditions and loads of different ways in which people look at things, even if it's news, and all of that. So when it comes to yoga, first of all, there is again a misconception that everyone in India practices yoga. They don't. There is a misconception that everyone in India is a Hindu. We aren't. And there is also a misconception that all people are highly spiritual, or they do all of this on an everyday basis. People don't. People come from different outlooks. People have different ways of thinking, ways in which they approach faith, ways in which they approach religion, and ways in which they approach spirituality. Of course, culturally speaking, the Indian or the South Asian people, not just Indian people, South Asian people, or most people in the East, that's why it's the entire Orientalism of it, is because everything in the global East of sorts has got a natural tendency towards spirituality. It's almost like the left side of the world. And so there is this natural tendency to go towards spirituality. But if we're speaking about India, because that's where a lot of current yoga has been codified and given to the world, in India, very generally speaking, there is a sentiment of an openness with cultural exchange, but not just to give and receive, but there is a general tendency to give more. So culture has us revering our guests as gods. So, and then if your guest is a god, you'd give whatever you have to your guest. So giving of our tradition and giving of our culture has come very naturally over historical times, including how the colonization of India began. There was this natural trust of, okay, whoever's coming in is a guest, in a way. But then, if you look at people today, in India, when it depends on who you're speaking with. If people are on the pulse and they are very socio-politically very sensitive, then they might be a little bit too tough on anyone trying to take of Indian culture. But then you might have someone else who thinks that Indian culture is very dominant or is the best thing for humanity, and they might want you to take it on. Right? And then there are others who really think that it's very nice and very sentimental, and it's very kind of people who want to come and experience our culture, and that's where there is cultural appreciation. So there is a fine line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. And that line, it's not just a fine line, it often gets blurred. So I'm not surprised that when you had your guest who felt very pleased with you chanting the Gayatri Mantra, because we have people like those. We have people who feel very very warm and very accepted when you have someone who traditionally is from a dominant culture, right? Now, this is again something that is a conditioning across generations that people have. There is an assumption that if someone is white and they're trying to experience the Indian culture, then there is the dynamics of someone being in power who's upholding your culture without actually realizing that your culture can stand up on its own without someone's validation.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.